Meghan's removal might have been dismissed as protocol if her position had remained empty. It did not. Another royal was quietly moved forward, placed beside the senior family members, and instructed to stand exactly where Meghan had been promised she would appear. That detail changed everything. The position beside Harry had not been erased from the arrangement. It had been reassigned to a family member whose constitutional role was far less important than the explanation later offered by the palace. Meghan had supposedly been excluded because the image was reserved for figures connected to the future of the crown. Yet the person now occupying her place did not meet that standard. The excuse no longer sounded like protocol. It sounded like cover. Harry had seen the earlier briefing. Meghan's name had been printed beside his, with clear instructions showing where they would stand. He compared it with the revised version and immediately noticed how carefully the alteration had been made. It was late enough that neither he nor Meghan had been given a real chance to object, but not so late that senior officials could claim it was an accidental change. Someone had approved it. Someone had known exactly what it would mean. The reactions around them made the silence even heavier. A few family members avoided looking at Meghan. Others remained strangely calm, as though the removal had been discussed before she entered the room. Catherine noticed Harry's anger almost at once. Her expression remained controlled, but there was something guarded in her silence, suggesting she understood that the decision reached far beyond a simple seating adjustment. Camilla showed no sign of interruption. Her attention remained fixed on completing the photograph. To her, the image appeared to matter more than the emotional damage unfolding only a few steps away. Harry demanded to know where the instruction had come from. Was it the sovereign? The private secretary? The communications office? The aide refused to name anyone. Instead, he offered a new explanation. The arrangement, he said, had been changed for visual balance. That phrase only deepened the contradiction. First, Meghan had been removed because of constitutional importance. Now it was about appearance. The palace was not clarifying its decision, it was changing the reason whenever the first one failed. Meghan understood what the photograph was becoming. It was not simply recording the family as they were. It was defining the family the palace wanted the public to remember. Those inside the frame would appear connected to continuity, power, and the monarchy's future. Those outside it could quietly be treated as though they no longer belonged. Harry considered walking away. Meghan stopped him. A refusal could be turned into another story about disobedience and division. So he remained, surrounded by smiles, while Meghan waited in an adjoining room and heard the camera shutters through the closed doors. When it was over, one royal approached her privately. The apology was soft, cautious, and deliberately incomplete. No responsibility was accepted. No name was mentioned. But the private apology carried an unsettling warning. The decision had not begun inside the photography room, it had been planned days earlier during a confidential palace meeting. Days before the family assembled, a confidential palace meeting had reportedly taken place without Harry or Meghan present. Officially, it concerned ceremonial planning. In reality, the discussion focused on a far more dangerous question. How much royal legitimacy should Meghan still be allowed to possess? Inside that private discussion were senior courtiers, communications advisors, and representatives from different royal households. They were not simply deciding where people should stand. Within the monarchy, an official family photograph is never treated as an ordinary picture. It becomes a record of rank, closeness, and approval. Years later, the image can still tell the public who was trusted, who was protected, and who was allowed to remain near the center of power. That was why Meghan's presence caused such concern. Some advisors believed placing her beside Harry would send a useful message. It could suggest that the family had moved beyond its conflict. It might calm public speculation and create the appearance of reconciliation without requiring the palace to make any direct statement. Others saw danger in exactly that possibility. They warned that the photograph could be used long after the event was over. Meghan's supporters might treat it as proof that her royal standing had been restored. Her independent projects could gain greater authority from the image. Every interview, speech, or future dispute might be strengthened by one powerful fact: the palace had placed her back beside the senior family. To those advisors, royal photographs worked almost like visual inheritance documents. They did not transfer property, but they appeared to transfer belonging. A person standing close to the crown could seem connected to its future, its history, and even its private legacy. One senior figure allegedly suggested a compromise. Meghan could be placed at the edge of the group, visible but separated from the central line. That proposal was quickly rejected. Even a position at the edge would confirm that she had been included. The palace wanted something more final. Complete removal became the recommendation. The explanation, however, could not reveal the real fear. It had to sound neutral, technical, and impossible to challenge. That was how phrases about constitutional roles and ceremonial balance entered the plan. There was also disagreement about when Harry should be told. One advisor warned that he would refuse to take part if he learned too early. Another argued that informing Meghan at the final moment would prevent negotiation and force the photograph to continue before anger could become action. Then came the phrase that exposed the true purpose: protecting the visual integrity of the crown. It was not about family comfort. It was about controlling what the public would be permitted to see. The confidential arrangement was revised. Meghan's name disappeared. Her position was assigned to someone else. Yet the urgency behind the decision hinted at something larger, because the photograph was being prepared for more than public reassurance. It was linked to a future statement involving royal titles, succession, and treasures whose ownership carried enormous emotional weight. That hidden connection became clearer when Meghan learned the photograph was not merely ceremonial. It would soon accompany an announcement about the family's future inheritance. The photograph was never intended to stand alone. Palace officials planned to release it alongside a carefully worded statement about royal continuity, family treasures, and future responsibility, turning Meghan's absence from a single image into something far more permanent and consequential. The announcement would describe a new arrangement for protecting some of the monarchy's most important possessions. Selected jewels, historic objects, private letters, and deeply personal family items were to be placed under carefully chosen custodians. The language would sound respectful and practical. It would speak of preservation, duty, and responsibility to future generations. But beneath those polished phrases was a much harder question: who could be trusted to carry the royal legacy forward? This was not simply about legal ownership. Many of the objects could never belong freely to one person. Their real power came from what they represented. To hold them, wear them, or appear publicly beside them was to receive a form of royal approval. It meant being presented as a guardian of history rather than merely a relative connected by blood or marriage. Meghan had believed Harry's family line would remain visibly included in decisions involving Diana's memory. Certain letters, photographs, and personal possessions carried meaning that went beyond palace tradition. Harry had grown up believing some of them would remain available to both sons and one day to their families. Meghan's removal from the photograph now suggested something else. The palace was not only separating her from the present, it was quietly pushing Harry's household away from the monarchy's future story. At the center of the tension was a disputed piece of jewelry once connected to Diana. Meghan had reportedly believed it might be made available for an important family occasion. Not as a claim to rank, but as a private link between Harry, his mother, and the life he had built. Palace officials saw a different possibility. If Meghan wore the piece, the public comparison with Diana could become immediate and overwhelming. The headlines would not focus on duty or tradition. They would focus on inheritance, rejection, and the woman whose memory still held more emotional power than many living royals. That made the photograph a boundary. Those standing inside it were presented as the trusted custodians of royal history. Those left outside might still be family, but they would hold no visible authority over what the monarchy chose to preserve. Harry soon learned that his name remained inside private inheritance documents. Yet, access came with conditions. Decisions could be delayed, reviewed, or restricted by officials whose authority was never clearly explained. Catherine's central position reinforced her future role as the leading woman of the next reign. Camilla supported the arrangement because it kept rival royal narratives from sharing the same image. Meghan finally understood that the strange explanation for her removal had hidden a deeper decision about memory, influence, and legitimacy. Harry understood something even more disturbing. This might not be a temporary exclusion. It could be the first example of a rule the palace intended to use again. And once that precedent was set, the palace could use it again not only to control photographs, but to decide who could wear the family's most emotionally powerful jewels. Behind the dispute over a family photograph was another battle the public had never seen. A historic jewel linked to grief, succession, and Diana's memory had become the center of a silent struggle, and Meghan's removal ensured she could never claim it publicly. The jewel had passed through a complicated royal history. It had once been connected to the Queen, later associated with Diana, and then quietly preserved for a future generation of royal women. Its value was not measured only in diamonds or craftsmanship. It carried memory. It carried rank. Most dangerously, it carried the power to suggest that whoever wore it had inherited a part of Diana's emotional place in the monarchy. That was why Meghan's interest caused alarm. Before an important public appearance, she had allegedly asked whether the piece might be made available. Her request was not presented as a demand. She believed the jewel held private meaning for Harry and could serve as a quiet connection to the mother he had lost. Yet the palace never gave her a clear answer. Instead, the request disappeared into procedure. There were inventory checks, insurance concerns, security reviews, and questions about whether the occasion was ceremonial enough. Each delay sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a wall. No official ever said no, but every new condition made approval less likely. Behind closed doors, the real concern was far more political. If Meghan wore the jewel, the image could dominate headlines across the world. The focus would not remain on the event or the senior working royals. It would shift to Diana, Harry, and Meghan's place inside the family. One piece of jewelry could create a public story the palace had no power to contain. Catherine's future position made her the preferred custodian. As the woman expected to stand beside the next king, she could wear historic pieces without appearing to challenge the line of succession. But the jewel's emotional connection to Harry complicated that decision. To him, the palace was using cold institutional language to control something deeply personal. Meghan began to understand the hidden rule. Access was not based only on marriage or family connection. It depended on rank, obedience, and usefulness to the crown. The photograph strengthened that rule. Those inside the official image could be presented as trusted guardians of royal heritage. Meghan's absence weakened any future claim that she should be allowed to represent it. Then, Harry received a warning. A courtier suggested that if he challenged the jewel decision publicly, other objects connected to Diana could also be reviewed. Letters, keepsakes, and private belongings might suddenly become harder to access. The threat trapped him between two loyalties. Defending Meghan could place parts of his mother's memory beyond his reach. Remaining silent would allow the palace to humiliate his wife without consequence. But Meghan refused to accept that bargain. She told Harry she did not want the jewel if wearing it required silence, submission, or gratitude for being treated as less than family. The palace had expected her to fight for access. Instead, she stepped away from the prize and prepared to challenge the stories surrounding it. Instead of demanding the jewel, Meghan turned her attention to the one thing the palace could not lock inside a vault: the story behind her disappearance from the photograph. The palace expected silence. Meghan offered something far more dangerous: restraint. She made no accusation, named no royal, and released no private document. Yet one carefully chosen public appearance transformed her absence from the photograph into the question the monarchy could no longer control. For several days, she said nothing. That silence denied the palace the reaction it had been prepared to manage. There was no angry statement to dismiss, no emotional interview to condemn, and no accusation that could be described as another attack on the family. Meghan refused to give officials the conflict they expected. Then she appeared beside Harry at an independent public event. They arrived calm, composed, and united. Meghan wore no royal jewel. She made no reference to the photograph, the inheritance dispute, or the private humiliation behind palace doors. On the surface, she offered the monarchy nothing to answer. But the official image from the event told its own story. Meghan stood at the center, surrounded by people associated with service, charity, and community leadership. No crown placed her there. No courtier approved the position. She was not presented as someone waiting to be accepted by the monarchy, but as a woman with influence beyond it. The contrast was immediate. Commentators compared the warmth and ease of Meghan's photograph with the stiffness of the palace portrait. Public attention began to shift. The question was no longer simply why she had been absent. It became far more damaging. Who had wanted her removed? And why did the explanation keep changing? The palace communications office responded with another clarification. This time, officials claimed the family image represented those holding active ceremonial responsibility. But the phrase created a fresh problem. Several people included in the photograph did not hold the same level of duty, while Meghan's original position beside Harry remained visible in earlier planning documents. Harry considered releasing that document. It would prove that Meghan had not misunderstood her invitation and that the change had been deliberate. Meghan urged him to wait. The palace was already weakening its own credibility. Every new explanation contradicted the last. That restraint caused panic among senior courtiers. Silence left space for suspicion, and suspicion was becoming more powerful than any direct accusation. Camilla reportedly wanted the controversy ended before it damaged the wider inheritance announcement. Younger advisors argued that the palace should admit an administrative mistake and move on. But an admission carried its own danger. It would mean accepting that Meghan had been publicly excluded without a defensible reason. Catherine became increasingly uncomfortable as her central position was interpreted as proof that Meghan had been removed to elevate her. William resented the suggestion that his wife had gained from another woman's humiliation, yet he would not challenge the palace in public. His silence protected the institution, but it also allowed the suspicion to grow. The conflict was no longer only about Meghan. It had become a test of whether the monarchy could acknowledge wrongdoing without appearing weak, and whether preserving authority mattered more than correcting a calculated act of exclusion. The palace might still have contained the controversy until an internal message surfaced revealing that Meghan's removal had been described in far harsher language than anyone had admitted. The official explanations spoke of balance, duty, and constitutional roles. The private message used different words. Meghan was not described as unavailable, unsuitable, or outside protocol. She was identified as a future narrative risk, a phrase that exposed the fear driving the entire decision. The message reached Harry through someone inside the palace who had become deeply uncomfortable with how the removal had been handled. It was not a public statement or a formal order. It was an internal email attached to a planning note, written in the cold language of strategy. Yet one phrase carried more truth than every explanation the palace had given. Meghan's presence, it warned, could remain influential for decades. Officials feared that the photograph might one day be treated as proof that she had been welcomed back into the center of royal life. It could suggest forgiveness, restored status, and official acceptance. More dangerously, it could strengthen Harry and Meghan in future disputes. If they were ever challenged over their place in the family, they could point to the image and say the crown itself had publicly included them. That was the real motive. The decision had never been technical. Meghan was removed not because of where she stood, but because of what her presence might mean. Harry felt the betrayal immediately. In public, the palace had hidden behind harmless phrases. In private, his wife had been treated as a long-term threat. He confronted a senior family member and demanded to know whether the language reflected the sovereign's personal wishes or the private judgment of advisors acting without direct approval. The answer was carefully empty. He was told that officials sometimes had to make difficult choices for the protection of everyone. No one accepted responsibility. No name was offered. The decision appeared to belong to nobody, even though several people had approved it and the institution had benefited from the result. Meghan recognized the pattern. Palace power rarely moved through direct commands. It traveled through suggestions, briefings, and decisions that became final before anyone could identify their author. Catherine later learned about the phrase and privately objected. She had not agreed to become Meghan's visual replacement, nor did she want her central position used as evidence of another woman's rejection. William, however, warned that reopening the matter could cause greater damage than the photograph itself. Harry rejected that argument. The damage, he insisted, had not come from Meghan standing near the family. It came from the deception used to remove her. The disagreement divided the palace. Some wanted the language investigated. Others wanted every copy of the message contained before it reached the public. Then, the disputed jewel was quietly removed from an upcoming exhibition, suggesting officials feared that its connection to Meghan, Diana, and the inheritance announcement might soon be uncovered. Now Meghan faced the choice the palace had tried to avoid. She could release the evidence and trigger a crisis, or remain silent and allow the official image to define why she had been excluded. Her decision would determine whether the photograph remained a symbol of palace control or became the image that exposed how frightened the monarchy had become of one woman's place in its history. The palace had removed Meghan to create a cleaner image of royal unity. Instead, her absence became the only detail anyone could see. What was meant to strengthen the monarchy's future now exposed its deepest weakness: the belief that controlling a picture could control history. Meghan chose not to release the full internal message. She understood that exposing every private word might create a scandal. But it could also allow the palace to shift attention away from the original decision and toward another argument about confidentiality. Harry took a narrower path. In a carefully written statement, he confirmed that the official explanation had not told the whole story. Meghan, he made clear, had originally been included. He revealed no private correspondence. He named no advisor. Yet the statement destroyed the palace's ability to present the change as a harmless misunderstanding. Officials refused to correct the record. An admission would have opened a far more dangerous question. How many official royal images had been shaped by hidden negotiations, private grudges, and strategic removals? The palace could survive criticism over one photograph. It was less certain it could survive public scrutiny of the machinery behind every carefully arranged display of unity. The debate grew beyond Meghan. People began questioning what absence meant inside a family built on hierarchy. Who decided where belonging ended? Who had the authority to turn a wife, mother, and family member into a threat simply by removing her from a frame? The photograph was meant to represent continuity. Instead, it became tied to exclusion, fear, and the quiet force of palace control. Meghan's position outside the image no longer weakened her. It strengthened the idea that her influence did not depend on standing near the crown. Harry, however, carried a heavier burden. He had remained in the photograph after Meghan was removed. Even though he had objected, his presence helped complete the message the palace wanted to send. That knowledge created fresh tension with relatives who insisted he should have understood the ceremonial necessity. Catherine later reached out to Meghan privately. She explained that she had not requested the revised arrangement and had not understood its full purpose. Meghan accepted the contact, but she refused to reduce the damage to one mistake. Too many officials had known. Too many explanations had changed. Too many people had benefited from her silence. The disputed jewel remained unworn. Palace officials kept it locked away, aware that any future appearance could reopen questions about Diana, inheritance, and why Meghan had been denied access. Quietly, new photography procedures were introduced. Any late change involving a family member would now require written approval. Still, there was no apology. Authority was protected, but emotional repair was sacrificed. Meghan kept a copy of the original arrangement showing her name beside Harry. Not because she needed proof that she once belonged there, but because it recorded the moment someone decided she should disappear. The palace had succeeded in removing her from one image. It had failed completely to remove her from the story. In the end, every controlled smile inside the photograph mattered less than the empty space the public had never been meant to question. Because inside the monarchy, the most revealing person in a royal photograph is sometimes not the one standing closest to the crown, but the one someone powerful decided should not be seen.